In our last lecture, we saw that from a Mahayana Buddhist perspective, the only truly meaningful life is a life motivated by compassion and committed altruistically to the benefit of others. And that we saw that from this perspective, the conviction that that's the only meaningful life is the only rational conclusion to draw from a real understanding of the omnipresence of suffering, from interconnectedness, and from selflessness. But we also saw a diagnosis of our ordinary human condition, the human condition that we might call the meaningless life, the life of being buffeted about. And that was the diagnosis offered in The Wheel of Life, in which, driven by fear, driven especially by this background fear of death, we constantly cycle helplessly from emotional state to emotional state. And even the most pleasant of those emotional states is, in the end, a source of suffering. So we've seen that there's this fundamental psychological block to meaningfulness, and to solve the problem of suffering, we need to solve that block. And that's what Shantideva's How to Lead an Awakened Life, Bodhicharya Avatara, is about. Shantideva begins with a reflection on human imperfection, on what our current state of life is like, and how difficult it is to cultivate virtue and to make our lives meaningful. And he begins by trying to understand the motivation that we might have, nonetheless, to cultivate virtue, even in the grip of vice. And the short way of seeing what his answer is that life without virtue, vicious life, is really bad. And that, in fact, our only hope for happiness, for individual happiness and a meaningful life, is to become morally better people. Now, Buddhism is a rich textual tradition. The texts have their own flavor. So today we're going to get textual and work through Shantideva's text, How to Lead an Awakened Life. And we're going to begin with some discussions in chapters 1 and 2. Here, Shantideva is thinking about the motivation for moral progress. And he begins by saying, in a kind of self-deprecating way, "There's nothing here that has not been said before, nor do I have any skill in composition. Thus, I have no concern for others, and I have composed my text solely to cultivate my own mind. Since my virtue is cultivated, my faith thereby increases in power. Nonetheless, if someone else with an outlook like my own sees this, it would be meaningful." Now, let's pause on that for a minute. Shantideva is pointing out a couple of things. The first is that this text might be of benefit to others, and that would be a very good thing. But the other thing that he's pointing out is that he himself hopes to benefit by writing this text, that by benefiting others, he hopes himself to become a better person and to attain what might be a meaningful life. He continues in verse 4 of chapter 1. "The time and opportunity, so hard to obtain, have been achieved, and they allow me to benefit the world. If I fail to take advantage of this opportunity, when will it arise again? Thus virtue is perpetually so feeble, and the power of vice is so great and terrible. If there were no bodhicitta," remember that's this altruistic aspiration for awakening, "what other virtue could overcome vice?" What's the point in these few verses? Shantideva is pointing out that in our ordinary lives we are overcome by motivations that in fact make our lives sordid and meaningless. Motivations of greed, fear, selfishness, avarice, and so forth. But we actually know, if we reflect on it even for a minute, that the cultivation of virtue and a concern for others is what would make our lives more meaningful. After all, when we look at other lives and we ask which one is the most meaningful, we don't pick the one that's most sordid, the one that's most selfish. We pick the one that is most beneficial to others. So, if for a moment we have the motivation to cultivate moral development, we should seize it. That's what Shantideva is saying here. And the primary purpose he identifies of moral development is to make our own lives better. But making our own lives better requires making the lives of others better. After all, the problem of suffering that the Buddha identified is the problem of our own suffering. However, the Mahayana insight that we looked at in our last lecture was this: interdependence means that the only way to solve the problem of our own suffering, to lead a good life, a life that we would care about for ourselves, is to solve the problem of the suffering for others. Now, Shantideva then begins to really work on fear. He argues that the vicious life, the life that we ordinarily live, full of vice, is permeated by fear, and that the fear of death conditions our lives by animating confusion, attachment, and aversion. And so in these verses, he really emphasizes that phenomenology of fear. He writes, "How shall I escape? Rescue me quickly. Let death not steal upon me before my vices have been eliminated. Thus, since I have not realized that I am ephemeral, that is, that I have passed over the truth of impermanence, through confusion, attachment, and aversion, I have committed many kinds of vicious deeds." The point here is that despite, or maybe even because of its pervasiveness, the fear of death is invisible to us. We don't pay attention to our momentary motivation, and then we get caught up in these motivations that we would never reflectively endorse. Shantideva continues that common sense suggests an obvious remedy. He says, "Now, having experienced the great terror, that is, having really focused on the fear of death as opposed to just letting it unconsciously animate me, heeding what you once told me," here he's referring to the Buddha, of course, "I approach you for refuge so that you might quickly dispel my fear. It makes no sense for me to enjoy the present day, saying to myself, I will not die just now. The time when I will cease to exist will inevitably arrive." So what is this all about? Shantideva has just diagnosed vice for us. He tells us that vice is grounded in fear and it generates fear. That's the central idea of that wheel of life. And the biggest motivation for virtue, then, is the fear that permeates that vicious life. That is, we want to get rid of that fear. The only way to get rid of it is by cultivating virtue. And that fear is grounded in the primordial awareness of death. Since vice and fear are so deeply interrelated, the only release we could possibly imagine from that horrible fear is the cultivation of virtue. So virtue is something we cultivate in order to make our lives peaceful, in order to make our lives meaningful, and in order to make our lives beneficial to others. Now recall, in our last lecture, we distinguished two kinds of bodhicitta, aspirational bodhicitta and fully engaged bodhicitta. The first step on the bodhisattva path is the cultivation of aspirational bodhicitta. Even though it's just aspirational, it's no mere wish. It's already a commitment to achieve awakening, and so it's already a personal transformation of profound importance. Engaged bodhicitta, on the other hand, is a goal that we can only achieve by cultivating all of the perfections on the bodhisattva path, especially the perfection of wisdom, because that's the perfection that allows us to engage with reality as it is, not as it appears to us through the haze of ignorance. And engaged bodhicitta is that spontaneous capacity to see things that have to be done and to do them, that arises out of deep insight. And so there's a neat idea here that coincides with those of Aristotle and the Taoists, that we've got this kind of deep insight that's cultivated that generates the possibility of spontaneity. Now, Shantideva, in the remainder of the text, begins to work through the structure of these perfections, beginning with generosity. That's the first of the virtues to be cultivated. And that is because generosity, according to the Mahayana tradition, enables us to depersonalize. When we get used to giving, we get used to reducing our attachment to our things. When we get used to reducing our attachment to things, we reduce our attachment to self. And as we reduce our attachment to self, we allow ourselves to stop seeing the world as me and everything else, because that's a terrible distortion, that innate view that places us at the center of the universe. It's a distortion because each of us has that view that can't all be right, and it's the distortion that generates pointless cycling through suffering instead of pointed altruistic aspiration. Shantideva writes, "And so I will perform these deeds through the virtue I thereby acquire. May I completely alleviate all of the suffering of all sentient beings. May I be the medicine for all who are ill. May I be both medicine and physician, preventing the recurrence of illness. Through showers of food and drink, may I alleviate the pain of hunger and thirst at times of famine. May I be both food and drink." So this is the generosity Shantideva is talking about. A tremendous commitment to benefit others, but also a commitment that I be the person who is the cause of that benefit, a resolution to do it myself. It's a transformation that takes me out of egoism and into the realm of boundless altruism, in which my life can be more than one of the petty lives led by 4 billion people on the planet. The second perfection is the perfection of mindfulness. We don't always think of mindfulness as constant attention, as a moral matter, except maybe when we have special obligations. Like, say, a surgeon has an obligation to be mindful while he's performing surgery. A guard has an obligation to be mindful while he's on sentry duty. But from the Buddhist perspective, it's always deeply moral, because it's mindfulness that keeps us focused on the virtues we intend to cultivate and on the degree to which our own activity reflects those virtues. It forces us to reflect constantly on our motivations and to reflect on what's going on around us that may demand our moral attention. So mindfulness is a central moral virtue to be cultivated. Shantideva writes, "One who wishes to protect his practice should be careful to protect his mind. If one does not protect one's mind, it's impossible to protect one's practice." That is, to protect that focus. And then he has this wonderful, wonderful metaphor. "The elephant of the mind causes much harm and degradation. Wild, mad elephants do not cause so much harm." That is, the image of the elephant here is something stampeding crazily around. And Shantideva has this vision that if we don't discipline ourselves, our minds just stampede from thing to thing, causing destruction wherever they go. Nonetheless, if the elephant of the mind is restrained by the rope of mindfulness, then all fear is banished and every virtue falls into our hands. Note again that emphasis on fear. When we restrain our minds and focus just on what needs to be done, we are able not to dissipate the inevitability of death, but to dissipate the constant effect that that background awareness of death has upon us. There's another reason for mindfulness. Shantideva argues that our own suffering is caused primarily by our own mental attitudes. And for that reason, he argues, we can lead a better life, not by transforming the world around us, but by transforming our minds. He has a wonderful couple of metaphors here. I want to take you through them. This is a fun one. "Who so purposely forged the implements of sentient beings' hell? Who constructed the floor of burning iron?" Let's pause on that for a minute. What he's doing here is talking about the traditional Buddhist imagery of what a hell is like, with all of these implements of torture on which the condemned are sitting on a floor of burning iron. And he's pointing out that these are psychological constructs. There's not a literal hell. There's an experience of being tortured, an experience of living on a floor of burning iron. And he asks, who purposely forged those? And then he asks, weirdly, and whence have those women come from? Now, the commentaries tell us who those women are. These are these kind of hideous, ghostly women who torment us from trees in hell realms. I didn't make this up. I can't help you with that. But that's the imagery. But he's pointing out that these aren't made from outside. He says in the next verse, the sage, that's the Buddha, has explained that the vicious mind gives rise to all of these. So there is nothing whatever in the triple world more frightening than the mind. The point here is that all of our suffering, our feeling that we're living in hell, our inability to be attentive to others, isn't caused by the world around us. The world around us might give rise to adversity, but to transform adversity into suffering, the mind has to get into action. And so mindfulness can cause us to stop our minds from making that next move, from adversity into suffering. So since vice on this view is a purely internal matter, and that's the source of our unhappiness, we need to look to the mind as our source of unhappiness, but that means that if we only transform the mind, we can transform unhappiness into happiness. And so Shantideva gives us a wonderful recipe for that transformation. Shantideva writes, "My enemies, as boundless as space, cannot possibly all be defeated. But if I defeat the anger in my mind, that is to defeat all of my enemies. No matter how bad things are outside, I can't do anything about that. Remember the idea in Stoicism, the idea of the arrow. I can control the shooting of the arrow, but not the hitting of the target. So focus on what I can control." And then Shantideva introduces one of my favorite of his metaphors. He asks at verse 13 in chapter 5, "Where is there enough leather to cover the entire world? But when I put on my leather shoes, that is to cover the entire world. Just so, I cannot control external things, but I can control my own mind. What need is there to control anything else?" It's a nice metaphor. The world is full of rocks and thorns and broken glass and stuff you don't want to step on. So if what you want to do is to make the world a safe place for you to stroll, you can do two things. One is you could just buy a whole lot of leather, cover the whole world with it, and things will be fine. Take care of the external world. The other thing you could do, though, is just put on a pair of shoes. And by putting on a pair of shoes, by taking care of yourself, you take care of the whole problem. And for that reason, Shantideva is saying, when we focus on suffering, whether my own suffering or the suffering of others, we want to focus not on the external conditions, but in order to transform suffering into happiness, in order to transform a meaningless, sordid life into a meaningful one, the transformation has to be not an external transformation, but the transformation of our minds. Shantideva then turns to another perfection, the perfection of patience. And the chapter on patience is perhaps the best known of all of the chapters in Bodhicharya Avatara. It's one the Dalai Lama never tires of quoting, and it's got tons of gorgeous poetry in it. Patience is a really important virtue from the standpoint of Mahayana Buddhism, because patience is the antidote to anger. If we're tempted to be angry with somebody, we want to be patient. If we're tempted to be angry with ourselves, we need to motivate patience. And it's also a state of mind that can block attraction and aversion. I really, really want that chocolate. Just be patient and think about what the consequences would be. I really can't stand this music. Just be patient and listen to it. Maybe I'll hear something in it that I like. It's also a very necessary virtue for anybody who is seriously committed to personal cultivation, especially moral cultivation of the kind proposed on the Mahayana path, because that's an arduous path. Self-transformation is really difficult. It's really hard. And if you're impatient with yourself from a Mahayana perspective, you'll never get there. In a lot of Mahayana teachings, people distinguish two kinds of patience: patience with oneself and patience with others. And they point out that patience with others, that's easy to cultivate. There's lots of ways you can convince yourself not to be angry with somebody else. Marcus Aurelius gave us some of those. Seneca gave us many of those. But the hard one is patience with oneself. It's so easy because we see our own faults and we see our own failings to deprecate ourselves, easier than you ever think, and often more destructive. And cultivating patience with oneself is the most difficult thing of all. Shantideva really focuses on the dangers of anger and why anger is such a very, very bad thing. And when we hear Shantideva here in chapter 6, the patience chapter, we are going to hear a lot of echoes of Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And there's no accident there, of course. If you start thinking hard about anger and really ask the question, when is the last time anger was beneficial to you? You're going to have a hard time answering that. Anger takes us over. Anger destroys our ability to think rationally. Anger destroys our ability to benefit others. It turns our life into the life of an animal, not the meaningful life of a human being. And that's what Shantideva is going to emphasize in this beautiful chapter. So let's follow him along. Shantideva writes, all of the virtuous actions amassed over 1,000 eons, such as giving alms and making offerings to the Tathagatas, are destroyed by a single instance of anger. What does he mean by that? He means something very, very, very straightforward. You imagine a life that you've led very, very well, very happily. You've made a lot of friends. You've got deep personal relationships. Think about what can happen in a moment of anger. You could harm somebody and never recover from that. You could destroy a friendship by a misplaced word and make the rest of your life one that you regret. You could alienate a child or alienate a parent. You could destroy a career by doing or saying the wrong thing. A single moment of anger can be so dangerous that no matter how much, of a bank of positive commitment you've been able to build up, no matter how much success you've been able to achieve, you can undermine it instantly in a single moment of anger. That's why anger is so important to control. Shantideva writes, there's no vice like aversion, and there is no ascetic practice like patience. When the thorn of aversion sticks in the heart, the mind finds no peace, nor can it achieve happiness or joy. Sleep does not come, and one's strength ebbs away. That is Shantideva saying when you're really bound up with hating somebody, or you're bound up with dissatisfaction, you're bound up with feeling that the world is doing you wrong. You're bound up with seeking revenge. You don't get any happiness. You don't get any joy. You stay awake all night, and you end up becoming a miserable creature. Anger doesn't benefit you. It's just like Seneca emphasized, right? It's not as though a little bit of anger is okay. A little bit of anger is a little bit of vice. Anger is just never okay. And Shantideva, again, echoing Seneca, argues that anger is always irrational. He gives us some wonderful examples to show us that it's never reasonable to be angry. And this is kind of nice, because remember when we discussed compassion, and we discussed the relationship between compassion and emptiness, between compassion and interdependence. We argued that if you really understand interdependence, and you really understand how small a part of the world you are, and how vast a part of the world everybody else is, and how much your own happiness is dependent upon that of others, your own suffering on that of others, the only rational response is a commitment not just to alleviate your own suffering, but that of others, because it's impossible to alleviate your own suffering without alleviating the suffering of others. So we saw that compassion or karuna is the only rational response to interdependence. Shantideva now argues that anger is always irrational. He says, I'm not angry at such things as bile, even though they cause great suffering. Why be angry at sentient beings? They too are driven by conditions. So here's the point. We saw Marcus Aurelius say something very similar. You know, if I've got a bad stomachache, my reaction isn't to be angry at my stomach, but to try to do something to alleviate it. Because I know that there's a cause for my stomachache, and what I have to do is to find that cause and to alleviate that cause, and anger isn't going to help me do that. Now, suppose somebody does something really mean to me. They say something terrible to me. They're insulting. They steal something of mine. They hit me, whatever. Let me think about their action. Let me think about why they did that. I don't need to think about whether it's justified or not, whether they were right to do it or not. That's beside the point. What Shantideva points out in the last line of this verse, that's verse 22 of chapter 6, is they too are driven by conditions. The point there is that whatever they did, they were caused to do, perhaps by their own psychopathology, perhaps by their own ignorance, perhaps by their own confusion about things. So if I'm not angry at my stomachache, which has causes, why should I be angry at them? It's like being angry at the stick that somebody uses to beat you and not the person. Then Shantideva continues, even without resolving, I shall become angry, people spontaneously become angry. Similarly, without resolving, I shall arise, anger just arises. The point here is that anger doesn't come from a decision. Anger comes from a failure to make decisions. Anger arises from a failure of mindfulness, from not paying attention. It allows us to be driven by causes rather than to take control of our own lives. Again, there's a nice echo here of the Gita, right? Don't allow yourself to be driven by what's happening around you. When you get angry, you are. So you're giving up on rationality. Shantideva emphasizes that anger isn't just harmful to other people, it's harmful to ourselves. It leads us to have accidents because we're not paying attention. You know, I might be so bound up with thinking about what I'm going to do to that person, I don't pay attention to what's happening on the road, or I don't pay attention to the fact that I'm walking downstairs. Anger leads to depression, he points out, that people become so depressed that the rest of their lives become miserable. Anger sometimes leads onward to suicide because anger can be turned inward at ourselves. Remember that issue about patience. Patience with ourselves is hard to cultivate. Anger with ourselves is easy to arise, and that can lead to suicide. And of course, anger can also lead to the loss of our reputations as other people think less of us, which then makes us less able to benefit others, because you can't benefit others unless they take you seriously. And if they think that you are somebody who has no self-control and who is just dangerous to yourself and those around you, you turn out to be totally worthless. So even to be effective as an agent, you need to control anger. Shantideva writes, since it's the nature of fools to harm others, my anger with them makes no sense, just as it would make no sense to be angry at fire, the nature of which is to burn. So again, if people have a particular kind of character or disposition, that might be a cause for compassion, a cause to do something to help them, but it's not a cause for anger. And if you notice, there's tremendous parallels here, both to Seneca and to Marcus Aurelius, who when they think about others who harm them say, think about what's wrong with them. Respond to them with pity. Respond to them with compassion. It makes no sense to respond to them with anger because they're behaving irrationally. That's a harm to themselves. If we are going to be beneficial to them, it's to help them overcome that irrationality, not to pile our own irrationality on top of theirs. So Shantideva argues that anger is both dangerous and it's irrational. And it also is overpowering, so it's something that we really have to deal with, with a great deal of effort. And it appears to be spontaneous. So if you want to avoid anger ruining your life, Shantideva argues, the only thing you can do is assiduously cultivate patience. And Shantideva thinks that understanding anger, meditating on anger, and thinking about anger analytically the way that we've been doing it now is the real instrument for cultivating that patience. Only if you understand that anger that way and then internalize that anger, and then internalize that understanding, make that understanding something that really motivates you, can you really overcome anger. Passion has to be settled, patience and compassion have to be settled into us as personality traits before they are real antidotes. And that settling requires mindfulness and requires meditation to make them parts of us. But, Shantideva points out, it doesn't just require mindfulness and meditation, it also requires wisdom, real understanding. And it's in the cultivation of wisdom that we make the transition from the aspirational bodhicitta that gets us to begin the bodhisattva path, that gives us the motivation to cultivate these perfections or these virtues, and engaged bodhicitta, the bodhicitta we aspire to attain by the end of the bodhisattva path. That's the distinction between just knowing analytically everything that we know here, that anger is bad, that patience is good, that others are driven by causes and conditions or so forth, and wisdom, where wisdom is the total absence of the superimposition of essences, the total absence of the superimposition of independence and an engagement with things as interdependent, as selfless, as impermanent, a spontaneous kind of engagement that allows the kind of virtuoso manifestation of compassionate action. This is what leads us to stop seeing ourselves as the centers of the universe, to recognizing the kind of selflessness that allows us to understand ourselves as constantly in interaction and in interdependence with others. So it's a rejection of our specialness, a rejection of the idea that the first person pronoun I marks something different, something special in the universe. If you honestly believe that of the entire universe, you are the one thing whose interests determine attention, then you can't possibly do anything to advance those interests, let alone the interests of anybody else. And your life will be a meaningless blip in the history of the cosmos. But if you can understand, and not only understand, but engage with the wisdom that you are part and parcel of an entire universe with which you are interdependent, you can make a difference. That's the idea. So with Shantideva, in this beautiful text, Bodhicharya Avatara, we find a really distinctively Mahayana Buddhist account of the meaningful life, this great vehicle animated by this understanding of the emptiness of essence and the centrality of the value of compassion that emerges from a real understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. This is a vision of a meaningful life as a life that is permeated by and founded in compassion and awareness of the real nature of the universe. And it's an account that is grounded in an understanding of vice as having its foundation in fear. So that when we cultivate compassion, when we cultivate an understanding of interdependence, we banish fear. That's the only way to banish fear. Because to the degree to which we think that we are independent and we are the only thing that matters, awareness of the fact that we are going to end our lives can only mean that the only thing that matters will come to an end. And that's what generates the fear of death that animates, in turn, our vice. This is a vision that says that the only way we can eradicate that fear, and hence eradicate vice, is through the cultivation of virtue. And those virtues involve both intellectual virtues of understanding, meditation, wisdom, philosophical analysis, and the moral virtues of compassion and generosity. Shantideva's vision is that this kind of cultivation, the Bodhisattva path, leads us to an entirely new way of experiencing ourselves, to experience ourselves as selfless, to experience ourselves as interdependent, to experience ourselves as those who can benefit the world. And it gives us an entirely different way of experiencing the world. Because then we can experience others in the world as intimately bound up with us, whose benefits and whose burdens are our benefits and burdens, whose pain, whose suffering is our pain and suffering, and whose pain and suffering we can alleviate in the process of alleviating our own. Hence the possibility of a life that can truly make a difference. We've seen tremendous parallels here to other people we've examined, to the work of Aristotle, to the work of Marcus Aurelius, in some ways to the work of Lao-Tzu, and even if you think about it, the Zhuangzi. This is all happening in India, of course, but it's all going to move to China because Buddhism moves to China. And when Buddhism moves to China, we're going to see that it interacts with Taoism and a whole new thing is born. That new thing is Zen, and that's where we're going to go in our next lecture.